Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we're going to pick right back up where we last left off, which was the heels of the Nixon resignation. But before we begin our lecture proper, I'd just like to do our customary recap and just touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So our last lecture dealt with the aftermath of the Watergate scandal, the complete implosion of Dick Nixon's presidency. The Watergate scandal dogged the last 2 years of Nixon's presidency, the first 2 years of his second administration. He was eventually forced out of office when it became apparently clear that the House was getting ready to indict him on a number of charges and begin the impeachment process, and that the Senate was sure to convict him should it get that far. Nixon, of course, had a somewhat successful domestic policy. He really continued, for the most part, the policies of the Great Society, with some tweaking that we'll get to later, namely tweaking as far as rolling back some of the protections granted to African Americans and affirmative action. But on foreign policy, he was an unrivaled genius. Vietnamization failed, but he had succeeded in ending the war on honorable terms for the United States. He had also succeeded in accomplishing détente with both the Soviet Union and China, and the trips to China and to Moscow during the early parts of his second term were just public relation coups. They really buoyed Nixon above and beyond his competition. Now, in the years after the Nixon administration, and the only way to really describe the end of his administration was catastrophic disintegration. The Republic went through a series of tumults. The presidents following Nixon, Gerald Ford, and later on Jimmy Carter, the winner of the bicentennial election or the 1976 election, and also Ronald Reagan, the former governor of California and actor, all sought to use their personal charisma to influence and guide the Republic, had Nixon had done. The respective presidencies all faced a series of obstacles and bore a number of hardships. Carter had to contend with the inflation and economic stagnation, a situation which earned the unflattering nickname Stagflation, as well as the fallout from the Iranian Revolution, which saw American diplomats be taken captive. Now, these foreign and domestic disasters led to a series of challenges for the presidency. Notably, within the challenges was the battle between Edward Kennedy, again rising as the presidential candidate, and Carter, who was able to fend him off. Now, Ronald Reagan, for his part, wrote a tidal wave of support from Christian reformers who were appalled by the turn of social events during the 60s and 70s. It was hoped that Ronald Reagan would return the nation. He would return the clock back, literally, on feminism, abortion. That Ronald Reagan would restore mandatory public prayer in public schools. Reagan also had to contend with negative publicity when the sordid aspects of his own foreign and domestic policies were exposed to the general public. Now, to begin with, I'd like to look at Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was a very unlikely figure in 20th century American politics. He was very fortunate in that he was able to win office, but very unfortunate in regards that he was beset by a tragic consortium of dilemmas upon taking office. Now, Carter was something of a maverick in politics at the time. He was a very active evangelical Christian who had never held federal office before. He had previously been a naval officer and most recently served as the governor of the state of Georgia. Carter benefited from the Watergate scandal in that he was seen as being a pure and wholesome candidate, uncorrupted by the Washington political machine. Now, among the eye-catching moments that bore witness to the rise of Jimmy Carter's national profile was a frank interview he had with Robert Scheer that was published in Playboy magazine. Now, in the interview, Carter admitted to lusting in his heart after other women. And that was meant to underscore his understanding of the temptation of sin. Now, it was a very bold thing to admit, as I'm sure his wife would have read or would have gotten wind of what he said in the article, but it angered many evangelicals. It angered them. He angered them by agreeing to the interview with Playboy magazine in the first place. And Playboy magazine then and now is viewed largely by evangelical Christians as a den of vice and sin. Now, Carter's family also attracted widespread attention. People remember the comic actions of his brother Billy, and of course his mother Lillian, who became a noted figure in her own right. Carter was an experienced politician. That should not be taken away from him. He understood very well that he could make use of the curiosity surrounding his family on a national scale, and that the slight use of being provocative would be enough to sort of keep interest in his family and sort of propel interest in his family. Now, in the election of 1976, he defeated the sitting president, Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford had gained office, of course, because of the Nixon and Agnew resignations. Gerald Ford had gained the Republican Party's nomination, but he wasn't a very strong candidate on his own. Once in office, Carter stated his intention to champion human rights and made a sincere attempt to establish a sound foreign policy based on Christian principles. Carter's decision to withdraw United States support for the Shah of Iran, which had been a part of the United States foreign policy for the last 5 administrations, was based on the Shah's documented history of human rights abuses. Carter withdrew United States support on the same grounds for the Nicaraguan dictator Somoza. Now, Carter also attempted to implement a lasting peace settlement in the Middle East. He was successful in arranging the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel, which is largely seen as the most important policy achievement during the Carter administration. Now, Israel had been constantly at war with her Arab neighbors since 1948. Carter had been able to pull off a diplomatic relations coup when he persuaded Egyptian President Anwar Sadat to take a tour of Israel, which had the result of transforming the geopolitical landscape as much as Nixon's visits to Moscow and China did. The two powers agreed to the basis of a treaty between the two at the presidential retreat. Tragically, however, Sadat paid for what was viewed as the betrayal of the cause back in Egypt. He was assassinated, Anwar Sadat. Carter also presided over the relinquishment of the Panama Canal, which had been built by the United States at the beginning of the 20th century in a show of imperialist force, but was universally derided by other regional powers as an example of American high-handedness and imperialism. Carter believed that the return of the canal to Panama would serve to improve American relations regionally. Now, the decision to return the canal to Panama led to a bitter debate in the United States Senate and and ended only with the single vote majority in favor of returning the canal back to Panama. Carter's domestic policy, his domestic economic policy, was hampered by the slow growth of the economy and, of course, by inflation. Typically, they don't coincide. But a host, and that is slow growth and inflation. Typically, they do not coincide together. But a host of factors relating to oil politics came together in a perfect storm. The price of oil was rising very rapidly, boosted by the growth of OPEC's international strength, the oil and petroleum producing countries. The rise in the price of oil led to the very rapid rise in tie-in industries such as transportation, which stifled economic growth. In 1979, what is known as the second gasoline crisis occurred. The first had occurred earlier during the Yom Kippur War of 1973. And this second crisis resulted in panicky scenes of long lines at fuel stations. The fury and the panic led to a rise in demand for fuel, efficient cars from Germany and from Japan. American automakers saw steep declines in profits, and the first major auto industry bailout occurred as Chrysler went bankrupt and had to be bailed out with federal loans. Now, in 1980, Carter faced a very serious challenge for leadership, perhaps the most serious intra-party challenge that he could have faced, and that was the nomination. That was from Ted Kennedy for the Democratic Party presidential nomination in 1980. Kennedy had succeeded to positions of esteem, to the positions of esteem and leadership held by his brothers. In the years between 1970 and 1980, Kennedy became a very vaunted figure on the Democratic Party scene. It was thought that Kennedy had made a remarkable recovery in the same vein that Dick Nixon had done during the 60s, and that now in 1980 he was in position to swoop in, much as Nixon was had been in position to swoop in and seize the presidency, seize the party nomination, and become president. He had stated earlier in 1969 the Chappaquiddick affair took place, in which a young woman, Mary Jo Kopechne, died. That had severely weakened his candidacy in 1972, and also sort of led to this follow scandal that clouded him around the country, except for Massachusetts, where he remained as appealing as ever to voters. Kennedy remained entrenched amongst the Massachusetts elites, and he hoped that with enough time, that once enough time had gone by, he would be allowed to mount a successful run for the presidency, much the way Dick Nixon had. He was mistaken. Ted Kennedy, Edward Kennedy, he was mistaken. And he found that many people continued to hold a sour image of him due to the Chappaquiddick scandal. The Carter administration, their big undoing involved a set of complex foreign relation matters that prevented him from fending off the more serious challenge from Ronald Reagan, the way that he had been able to fend off the challenge from Ted Kennedy. He largely fended off the Ted Kennedy challenge without going negative. Now, the worst of the foreign policy matters for Jimmy Carter involved the Iranian Revolution. When the American embassy was seized by a group of students from Tehran, that embassy was held hostage. That embassy was invaded, taken over, and the Americans who were there, the 67 Americans who were there, were held hostage from November 1979 for the next 444 days until literally the beginning stages of the Reagan administration, and largely they refused to hand over the hostages until Reagan took over. Now, the embassy attack was done in retaliation for Carter's decision to allow the exiled Shah into the United States for cancer treatment. Now, the religious leaders of Iran, the new Ayatollah Khomeini, who had been exiled and returned to Iran in triumph, became the new de facto dictator in Iran, implementing a theocracy, or a rule by religion, in which the religious clerics now held complete control. A good way to view Iran is that it is the Islamic version of, let's say, the Vatican. To where the Vatican is a theocracy, you have an elected leader in the Pope, but the Pope's real position, his real power, comes from the fact that he is a religious leader. So, and it's sort of interesting parallel there. But back to the Iranian Revolution, to the problems in Iran. The news that the United States covered the news in the United States covered the massive demonstrations in Tehran, with crowds shouting "Death to the Shah," "Death to Carter," "Death to America." There was also public displays of disdain, such as burning the United States flag and effigies of Carter and Uncle Sam. And with that said, we'll break here and we'll come back with part 2 of our examination on the Carter administration, where we will look at Jimmy Carter's response to the actions in Tehran, the hostage taking, and the anti-American sentiments. As always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.